Now, the shipment reportedly includes VN-22B fire support vehicles, PLL-05 self-propelled gun mortars, and SR-5 multiple rocket launch systems, all produced by Norinco, which is China's leading defense exporter.
Africa just broke the pattern, quietly, decisively, and without asking for permission. On October 10, 2025, Burkina Faso received a shipment of advanced Chinese weaponry that Western analysts had not anticipated. It wasn't just trucks and cannons rolling into Ouagadougou, it was the sound of an old order collapsing. For decades, Africa was told to depend. Now it's preparing to defend. What appears to be a military deal is actually a declaration. The continent no longer fights with borrowed strength. And what does this mean for the whole continent? Let's find out. Something changed in Ouagadougou on October 10, 2025. And it wasn't just the sound of engines or the flash of cameras. It was the feeling that the center of gravity in global power had shifted, even if only slightly, toward African soil. For the first time in decades, a West African nation didn't wait for Western permission to upgrade its defense. It did it on its own terms. The delivery of Chinese-made armored vehicles and artillery to Burkina Faso was not a spectacle for show. It was a signal that Africa's patience had expired. This wasn't a donation wrapped in diplomatic language. It was a calculated decision. A country once constrained by dependency, now choosing direction over desperation. 6 VN-22, B-100 5mm fire support vehicles, 4 SR-5 multiple rocket launchers, 6 SM-6/WMA 09 120mm self-propelled mortars, 2 WZ-551 command vehicles, 6 EQ-2050 Mengshi armored trucks armed with laser-guided missile systems, 14 SH-11 22mm howitzers, 16 towed artillery pieces, and a convoy of logistics trucks. Together, they represented more than hardware. They represented leverage. For Burkina Faso, these machines were not mere tools of war, but symbols of self-determination, tangible proof that the Sahel could still build its own narrative, even as chaos surrounded it. The timing was precise, almost poetic. Just months earlier, Western security missions in the Sahel were scaling back, citing budget constraints and strategic reorientation. France had withdrawn, the United States had reduced engagement, and European Union funding had dried up under shifting priorities. Yet the violence in northern Burkina Faso didn't pause. Villages were still attacked, civilians still displaced, and young soldiers still buried in silence. When the West stepped away, China stepped forward, not with promises, but with precision. The move was not about ideology, it was about arithmetic. The cost of waiting had exceeded the cost of acting. In the geopolitical marketplace, where loyalty often matters less than leverage, Burkina Faso made a practical choice: partner with whoever shows up when you call for help. And Beijing did not with speeches, but with shipping containers. But this was not just an arms transaction, it was a psychological revolution. Every delivery truck that rolled into Ouagadougou that morning carried an invisible message written across its hull. Africa has options. For decades, the continent had been locked into dependency cycles: aid, reform, report, repeat. Now that loop was broken. The very image of a Chinese delegation standing beside Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not as superiors but as equals, reflected a truth that Western policymakers were slow to admit. Respect, not rhetoric, had become Africa's new currency. And what makes this moment historic isn't only who supplied the weapons, but why they were accepted. Burkina Faso didn't turn to China out of blind admiration or ideological alignment. It turned out of exhaustion. Exhaustion from being told what to do by those who never faced its enemies. The delivery was a direct response to years of imbalance, where Western powers dictated the terms of peace while Africans paid the price of war. With every armored vehicle that touched Burkinabe soil, the message grew louder. Partnership must now come with parity. Still, behind the optimism lies a deeper tension. If the Sahel is rewriting its alliances, what happens to the old order built on Western dominance? Can Africa truly forge its independence in a world where power is rarely shared, only shifted? For 2 decades, Western powers claimed to secure the Sahel. They built bases, held conferences, sent advisors, yet none of it stopped the bloodshed. Billions in counterinsurgency funding turned into a revolving door of training missions and withdrawal statements. France's Operation Barkhane collapsed under its own contradictions. The United States turned its eyes elsewhere. And when things got tough, Africa was told to wait. again. Burkina Faso had been patient. It accepted the lectures on democracy, the endless reform roadmaps, and the neatly packaged aid that came with invisible strings. But no nation can fight insurgency with PowerPoint presentations. By 2024, over 40% of the country was outside government control. Villages burned while reports were written in Brussels. Soldiers fought with outdated rifles while foreign consultants debated stability frameworks. The message was clear. The West wanted control without commitment. Then came the breaking point. When Western forces pulled out of Mali and Niger, the entire regional security chain collapsed. The insurgent groups didn't retreat, they advanced. Burkina Faso was suddenly holding a crumbling front line with no backup. And in that vacuum, China appeared, not as a savior, but as a supplier. What Beijing understood was simple. People don't need charity, they need capacity. It offered weapons, logistics, and training, not ideology. For the first time, Ouagadougou wasn't treated like a student in a seminar. It was treated like a partner in strategy. And that distinction changed everything. Western analysts, of course, rushed to call it influence or debt diplomacy. But that's how empires talk when they lose their monopoly on loyalty. In truth, China didn't manipulate Burkina Faso. It respected its choices. And that respect, after decades of patronizing diplomacy, was revolutionary. The West's failure wasn't about resources. It was about arrogance. It kept mistaking dominance for partnership. It was thought Africans would remain grateful for crumbs while the table grew heavier with other people's wealth. But a continent that has learned to survive centuries of exploitation also learns to recognize when the tone of help sounds too familiar. Burkina Faso's deal with Norinco wasn't anti-Western. It was post-Western. It was a statement that Africa can diversify its friendships without needing to justify them. China's appeal lies not only in affordability, but in predictability. No moral lectures, no regime change agendas, no economic traps disguised as aid. Just exchange, in its simplest form, security for partnership. And that's what makes this story bigger than Burkina Faso. It's a sign of Africa's emotional maturity, a continent that no longer confuses friendship with dependency. The West believed African nations would cling to their aid pipelines forever. But Africa's new generation of leaders, men like Ibrahim Traoré, are rejecting that script. They don't want to be told what democracy looks like. They want the tools to defend the one they choose. That's why the handover in Ouagadougou felt less like a transaction and more like a verdict, a quiet judgment on decades of broken promises. The West had its chance to prove partnership meant equality, and it failed. Now, as China steps into the vacuum, a more profound question surfaces. What happens when Africa stops needing the West altogether? Because once a continent learns it can secure itself, it won't just stop borrowing weapons, it'll stop borrowing worldviews. And that shift is already underway. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When France pulled out of Mali and Western partners retreated from Niger, chaos could have followed. Instead, something unexpected took shape. The Alliance of Sahel States AES, a union of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, was born from the very instability that outsiders predicted would destroy them. It began quietly, through emergency meetings between military leaders who realized they were fighting the same enemy but in isolation. It grew into something bigger, a regional defense compact built not around ideology, but around survival. The principle was simple: no more begging for protection from those who benefit from our weakness. The AES promised joint intelligence sharing, border coordination, and a unified command structure to take on insurgencies that had exploited every crack between their borders. But the symbolism went deeper. It was a declaration that Africa could defend itself without foreign boots or Western signatures. That's where China fit in naturally. Beijing didn't dictate the alliance, it reinforced it. Its supply of equipment to Burkina Faso provided the logistical backbone that the AES desperately needed to transform from an idea into a functioning military bloc. The VN-22Bs and SR-5 rocket systems may sit inside Burkina Faso's borders, but their strategic purpose extends far beyond. They form part of a shared deterrent, an African arsenal for African defense. The West, watching from a distance, misread this as an act of defiance. But to the people inside the Sahel, it was an act of self-definition. For decades, Western powers defined African unity as a conference table in Brussels. Now unity looked like three nations training together in the desert, coordinating air support, and pooling intelligence through their own channels rather than waiting for someone else's satellite feed. And the shift isn't purely military, it's cultural, it's philosophical. The AES represents a generation of African leadership that no longer measures progress by donor satisfaction. Its leaders, Traoré in Burkina, Goïta in Mali, and Tiani in Niger, speak the same language of political independence. They've watched what reliance on external powers has done to others. Fragile governments toppled when funding dried up, sovereignty traded away for aid checks, policies rewritten in foreign capitals. They've decided to step off that treadmill. Of course, cooperation among the AES members isn't without friction. Each has its own security realities, ethnic tensions, and economic fragility. But for the first time, their weaknesses are being confronted collectively rather than exploited separately. The very fact that Burkina's Chinese-built rocket launchers might one day support Nigerian or Malian troops marks a fundamental reimagining of African defense logic, from fragmented and reactive to coordinated and proactive. This evolution has forced a new question onto the world stage. If African states can build their own defense networks, what stops them from building their own economic and diplomatic ecosystems next? The logic is consistent. Security first, sovereignty second, prosperity third. The AES isn't just protecting borders, it's laying groundwork for a political identity built around autonomy. And here lies the quiet genius of Burkina Faso's pivot to China. It gave the alliance proof that independence is possible. The sight of those Norinco vehicles rolling through Ouagadougou sent a message not just to the West, but to Africa itself. We can supply our own destiny if we cooperate. But ambition always comes with a test. Power is seductive, and unity is fragile. The next challenge for this new alliance isn't defeating militants. It's defeating mistrust between ethnic groups, between armies, between partners. Because the same tools that can secure a region can also destroy it if the vision behind them wavers. The Sahel story, then, isn't merely one of rebellion against the old order, it's an experiment in building a new one. Whether it succeeds depends on what happens next. Can the alliance of Sahel states turn military cooperation into moral cohesion? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The arrival of Chinese-made weapons has raised both hope and fear. Hope, because Burkina Faso finally possesses the means to fight insurgents on equal terms. Fear, because unchecked power in a region scarred by mistrust can easily tip into abuse. The challenge ahead is not to use the new tools effectively. That part is technical, but to use them wisely. The first few months after the handover will determine whether this partnership becomes a story of liberation or a cautionary tale of excess. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knows this better than most. His government didn't inherit a stable nation, it inherited trauma. The state's authority had collapsed in half the country, with some villages living under insurgent rule, others under community militias, and many caught between. In these conditions, a modern army can become both savior and threat. If not disciplined, the same weapons meant to restore order could deepen division. The army's credibility depends on how it treats its own citizens as much as how it fights its enemies. There's already a precedent to be wary of. In early 2025, the Solenzo massacre exposed the cost of militarizing desperation. Over 130 civilians, mostly Fulani, were killed by state-backed volunteers in an anti-insurgency operation gone wrong. The incident shocked even Traoré's supporters, forcing his administration to promise reforms and retraining. The new Chinese equipment, arriving only months later, now represents a second chance, a chance to prove that modernization doesn't have to mean militarization without morality. The Chinese partnership brings another layer of complexity. While Beijing provides weapons, it also emphasizes operational control and efficiency. Its military advisors often advocate precision strikes and structured logistics, not the chaotic, emotion-driven warfare that has plagued many African armies. If Burkina Faso absorbs those lessons rather than just the machinery, it might finally evolve into the disciplined force the region desperately needs. But discipline cannot be imported. It has to be grown through leadership, accountability, and a culture that values human life even in the fog of war. Then there's the psychological factor. For the first time, Burkinabe soldiers have technology that can outmatch their opponents. Drones, rocket systems, and rapid deployment vehicles create a sense of invincibility. But invincibility breeds recklessness if it isn't tempered by wisdom. This is the paradox of empowerment. The moment you stop feeling vulnerable is the moment you risk becoming careless. Traoré's government must therefore shift from a survival mentality to a governance mentality to prove that control doesn't end at the battlefield, but extends into how victories are handled after the smoke clears. Another dimension of responsibility lies in communication. The government must redefine how it reports its operations, how it accounts for civilian impact, and how it builds public trust. The population isn't just watching whether the army wins, it's watching how it wins. Transparency, once seen as a Western import, now becomes an African necessity because legitimacy cannot be built in secrecy. But the ultimate responsibility goes beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within the alliance of Sahel states, the actions of one member affect all. A single misused rocket or a poorly executed campaign could strain alliances, provoke backlash, or justify renewed Western criticism. The alliance's moral authority will rest on Burkina Faso's conduct, and Traoré knows it. So the next chapter isn't about adding more weapons to the arsenal. It's about learning how to manage what's already there. Power, once obtained, demands maturity. The same strength that can rebuild Burkina Faso can also unravel it if not guided by restraint. And that brings us to the most critical question of all. Now that Africa has the tools and the unity, can it turn power into stability? Burkina Faso now stands at a historic threshold. It has weapons to defend itself, alliances to support its sovereignty, and an emerging sense of continental identity that refuses to be patronized. But the future of this transformation depends on whether African nations can turn power into policy and policy into permanence. Military independence, after all, is only the first layer of freedom. Economic and intellectual independence must follow for sovereignty to be complete. China's partnership offers a new model for that journey, one grounded in mutual gain rather than moral supervision. Where the West demanded compliance, Beijing offered cooperation. It didn't ask for the right to dictate policy. It simply traded capability for commitment. This is the quiet genius behind the shift. African states aren't aligning with China out of ideology, but out of logic. The logic that whoever helps you build your strength deserves your respect, not your subservience. But what makes this moment different from past revolutions is that it isn't driven by anger. It's driven by awakening. Traoré's government doesn't seek to erase the West. It seeks to outgrow it. The focus is not revenge but relevance, the desire to finally exist in a world that measures Africa by its potential, not its problems. That shift in mentality is perhaps the most powerful weapon Africa has ever developed, and no one can take it away. This is where the alliance of Sahel states becomes more than a military pact. It is evolving into a framework for continental self-governance, a prototype for the future African Union that prioritizes self-sufficiency over symbolic unity. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can sustain collective defense while coordinating resources, industries, and infrastructure, they could redefine what it means to be independent in the 21st century. A regional defense compact could easily evolve into an economic corridor, then into a political bloc that speaks to the world not as clients, but as equals. But make no mistake, this path won't be peaceful. Every step toward African self-determination threatens old systems that profited from dependency. Western media will call these alliances authoritarian or foreign interference. Aid packages will be reduced, and sanctions may follow. That's the price of power. The moment you stop asking for help, you start being treated as a rival. Burkina Faso must brace for that resistance, because the world rarely applauds those who stop being convenient. And yet, that friction is exactly what proves progress is real. A dependent Africa never provoked global anxiety. A confident Africa does. What's emerging now isn't just military strength, it's psychological liberation, the courage to imagine a continent whose destiny isn't outsourced to Washington, Paris, or Brussels. The sight of Burkinabe soldiers driving Norinco vehicles across the Sahel is more than an image of defense. It's the metaphor of rebirth, the first chapter in Africa's modern sovereignty. If this momentum continues, if discipline sustains the victories and alliances hold under pressure, then the next time history writes about Burkina Faso, it won't just say it bought weapons from China. It will say it pioneered a doctrine, a new African realism that believes in action over apology, partnership over permission, and sovereignty over sympathy. Because in the end, this isn't just about Burkina Faso defending itself. It's about Africa learning to defend its dignity. The weapons are the beginning, but the real revolution is in the realization that the continent no longer needs anyone to protect its freedom. It just needs the courage to keep it. Do you think Africa's partnership with China marks true independence or just a new kind of alliance? Let us know in the comment section. Can the Sahel's new military strength bring peace without repeating the mistakes of the past? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.